these slides, inshallah, on logic and philosophy in the presence of my beloved teacher, Maulana Muhammad Salim, who I've benefited extremely and significantly from these past 6 years, and whom I've benefited from prior to that through my family members, and whom he has benefited prior to that. And it's a great privilege to present it to you uncles and to you young ones who will be the future of the ummah, and the uncles who have exerted much effort for all of these students, and more than I have done so far, and whom inspire me continuously, alhamdulillah. So without further ado, inshallah, we'll make a start. One of the imams, perhaps not the most famous of imams, but fairly substantive, his name was Muhammad Alish. He was a very famous Maliki jurist, and he was the Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar at a point around the 18th century, I believe. He had a book called Taqrib al-Aqa'id, and he tried to just mention some of the key fundamental beliefs of Islam that are logically justifiable. And he has a saying in that book, إِذْ كُلُّ مَنْ قَلَّدَ فِي التَّوْحِيدِ إِيمَانُهُ لَمْ يَخْلُ مِنْ تَرْدِيدِ, that anyone who imitates another in his belief in Tawheed, in the oneness of Allah, his faith is not safe from doubt, subhanAllah. It's a beautiful saying, and it obviously rhymes as well in Arabic. The reality is, our ulama were the people who pioneered philosophy and logic, to the extent where one of the biggest professors in the West, Professor Peter Adamson, who I've met personally and who teaches at the university I went to and still go to, he has learnt Arabic and he has been studying Islam and Islamic philosophy for I think over a decade now. And he said that really the Islamic golden age never ended in the 12th or 13th century. That is the point, and he gave this talk at Google, by the way. Google invited him to give this talk. It's on YouTube. He said at that point, that's when the West stopped benefiting from the Muslims in philosophy, because the Latin Arabic translation movement stopped as Andalusia, Spain, was taken away from the Muslims, and the Muslims retreated back, and Moses Maimonides, a very famous Jewish scholar and philosopher, he couldn't really take their works anymore and translate them because they had to retreat from Andalusia. But up until that point, the Europeans continuously benefited from us, to the extent where you hear the great names of the West who you're impressed by. Gottfried Leibniz, one of the greatest mathematicians and philosophers, Isaac Newton, René Descartes, these big names and many more. They benefited a lot from the scholastics like Thomas Aquinas, and Thomas Aquinas directly took, even mentioning them in his book, from the likes of Ghazali, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, etc. So the Western European tradition of academia and intelligentsia and everything owes a lot to Islam. And Peter Adamson, when I met him about 5 months ago, his talk was actually how Islamic philosophy can solve some of the major philosophical problems we have today in the 21st century, such as defining knowledge. So if we go back, and the likes of Asrar Rashid has also mentioned this in public, if we go back to the books of Ilm al-Kalam and Mantiq, of philosophy, we will pull from there the solutions to all of the problems we have today as an ummah. And Muhammad Alish is just one person who's encapsulating this with his quote right now. So this topic of falsafa and mantiq and philosophy and logic and ilm al-kalam and theology is of absolute and utmost priority. You would find that many of the major fuqaha, they would be using mantiq in deriving fiqh. Many of the great fuqaha would also be great people in theology. Imam al-Nasafi, one of the greatest Hanafi ulama. Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Maturidi, someone who looked at the Hanafi madhab in a completely different way. He said, we have the case-based law.
Abu Mansur.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, sorry, I've conflated the names. So he would look at the Hanafi fiqh and derive it just from logical principles, subhanAllah. So there is a great benefit in it. So without further ado, there is so much that could be said about the background of falsafa, but we'll make a start, because the most important thing about logic and philosophy is the ability to do it, more so than who made it and how it came about. Every civilization, everyone's participated in it, from the ancient Greeks to the Muslims to later on. So the first, really, if you want to understand philosophy and logic and you want to be able to execute it and do it, it's a very simple subject. It's a subject which I truly and genuinely believe every single person can do, regardless of whether they don't think they're smart or whether they think they're a quick learner or not. Philosophy, inshallah, and logic in particular will make you a smarter, more efficient, more articulate person, especially if it's coupled with Islam. That's the most important. Yes. Oh, yeah, I'll record it on here, inshallah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Yes, just over there. Alhamdulillahi wahdah wa salatu wa salamu ala man la nabiyya ba'dah. So we don't want to imitate our belief, we want to get it, we want to derive it and derive the truth using logic. So in philosophy, we could really understand the subject by understanding just a few, perhaps less than 10 key terms. And once we understand those terms, we can really get a good grip. And we're using logic every day. We're participating in philosophy every day. But now we just have to make it explicit. How are we doing that? And once we make it explicit, we become more efficient and better at it, and it benefits us in all aspects of our lives. And even our personal relationships with people, our belief in Allah, our ability to communicate, logic can benefit all of these things. And I can tell you from my own experience and many others. So the first thing we want to do, and I suppose the main aim of philosophy nowadays, especially since the 20th century, has been to construct something called an argument. Now, an argument is not two people having a shouting match. Yep, that would be another form of argument. But an argument is something where we simply have things called premises and a conclusion. That's all an argument is. A bunch of premises and a conclusion. And even a conclusion is technically a premise. So technically, an argument is just a bunch of premises. And the next question, of course, is, what are premises? Premises are also very simple to understand. They are just sentences or expressions that are either true or false in any language. So we could say, for example, Maulana Salim is older than Brother Sami. This is either true or false. He's either older than me in age or not. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's true or false, obviously it's true, but it has a truth value. It's one or the other. There's no other option. Compare that to another sentence. For example, if I ask Uncle Norman, for example, how are you? That doesn't have a true or false value. His response has a true or false value. I'm good. Either he is good or he's not good. I'm well. But the question has no value. If we say, for example, if we ask a student to sit down, a command phrase, that has no truth value. It's not true or false. It's just a request to somebody. Again, you can express this in other languages. Ijlis, sit down in Arabic, doesn't have a true or false value. But if I say, for example, if there's a book, هذا هو كتاب, this is a book. Again, that is a declarative sentence. That is a premise. That's either true or false. That is either a book or it's not a book. It'd be better if I picked it up and got it to make it explicit, but that's fine, inshallah. Even in German, Schnee ist weiß, snow is white. That's either true or false. Either snow is white or it's some other color. So these are all sentences that can be true or false. So we want to get these sentences and put them together and then come to a conclusion which is true. And what conclusions do we want? Well, first and foremost, we want the ones that are most important to us. Does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exist? Yes, Allah exists. That's our conclusion. Is the Quran the inimitable speech of Allah? Yes, it is. How do we get to that conclusion? And all we're trying to do is build some premises so that we can go from those premises to a final conclusion. We're going from one step to another.
So far, clear? Any question on this? Premise समझ में आ गया? Premise समझ में आ गया? पूछूंगा मैं आखिर में सेशन के बाद definition. Premise का मतलब ये है कि कोई ऐसा जुमला, कोई ऐसी बात, ऐसा स्टेटमेंट कि जिसको आप सही या गलत साबित कर सके, उसके बारे में आप ये कह सके कि हाँ ये सही है या ये गलत है. वो असल में है कि नहीं वो अलग बात है. The answer would be उसके सही या गलत होने में. It's like a statement of fact, some sort of fact, whether it's fact or not, but कोई statement, declarative sentence.
Jazakumullah khairan. If there's any questions, inshallah, please feel free to ask, and if anything's unclear, please feel free to ask. So we start with our first one, our first argument. It's a very simple one, but the most simple examples in philosophy are the most powerful at deriving the lessons. Premise 1, Socrates is a human. We use Socrates because everybody knows who Socrates is. Premise 2, all humans are mortal. What can we derive new once we have these two pieces of information? If Socrates is human and all humans are mortal, we get the conclusion, Socrates himself is mortal. This is what we would call a logical syllogism, but again, that terminology, we don't need to use it, it's perfectly fine. So this is very powerful. The human mind can go from these premises to this conclusion, and this is one of the key defining features of humankind, alhamdulillah. And you might think this is very trivial, I do this every day in my life. But you're about to see how powerful what Allah has bestowed us with really is in a minute. Again, we could express it another way. We could say all humans are mortal, Socrates is a human, Socrates is mortal. So it doesn't matter which order the premises come in. We could use different words, but the meaning is the same and we derive the same conclusion. And that's quite important. Now here is where our logic comes in. Raise your hand if you know what the term truculent means. Does anyone know what truculent means? No, very good. This is exactly one of my philosophy professors at King's College. He used this example to bring out this point. If I say to you Socrates is a human, or let's use actually I don't want to use Maulana Salim because this is not the best. We'll use my own name. We'll say Sami is a human. Sami is a human. All humans are truculent. What can you now tell me about me? Forget whether it's true or not, but let's say, just assume these are true. Just assume premise 1 and premise 2 are definitely true. Jazakallah khairan. Jazakallah khairan. Sami is truculent. Or Socrates is truculent, etc. Now you don't even know what the term truculent may mean. But what you've just derived from this example has to be without a shadow of a doubt true. Without even knowing what the terminology is. This is the power of aql. أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. Allah asks us, do we not use our aql? We can go with just not even knowing all the information to deriving a conclusion. And this is really a fascinating thing, especially in neuroscience and other subjects. And Uncle is most certainly right. Socrates, or if you use me as the example, is truculent. Now, there are also bad ways to make arguments. There are arguments that don't work. This is another one. Premise 1. All whales are mammals. Premise 2. Socrates is a mammal. Conclusion. Socrates is a whale. Your mind, that does not work. Your mind automatically knows it doesn't work because you're bestowed with logic. It's Allah's gift to us, alhamdulillah. But why does it not work? This is why we have the study of logic, inshaAllah. This is what we would call an invalid argument, and we'll get to those properties in a minute. So far, all we're trying to do is make arguments, and all we're trying to do is bring out some good conclusions from some premises. Okay. Yeah, so this doesn't work as we've just discussed. But there is something interesting you could say. If these two were true, forget whether they're true or false, but let's just assume they're true. Premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true. You could derive from this, all whales are mammals, Socrates is a mammal. You can derive some pretty trivial conclusions. Maybe they don't matter to you, but you can still come up with them. All whales are mammals and Socrates is a mammal. Now you may say, Sami', you're not telling us anything new. You're just re-expressing everything in a different way. But this is how logic works. And there's a reason we need this rigid structure. Because we're trying to make things mathematical. And there's a reason for that, which we'll get to later. You could re-express the conclusion from the premise. If I know Socrates is a mammal, guess what else I also know? Where I can go from there. Socrates is a mammal. I can re-express the same thing from the past. Now, this argument might not be very good, it might not inform you of anything new, but it's possible and it's still fine. This is a valid argument. Here is a weird example, and you don't need to, if you don't understand it, it's fine, but there's a reason I'll go into this in the future. When you have this term or, you can add anything on the other end of it, as long as something is, at least if one side of the or statement is from the premises, then the other side you can add anything else. For example, you can say all whales are mammals, Socrates is a mammal. Socrates is a mammal or Socrates is a mortal. Now where on God's green earth did that second part come from, Socrates is a mortal? That doesn't matter. Because as long as one part, or one side of that is correct, Socrates is a mammal, Socrates is immortal, then the statement is still true. Because an or function only needs one side to be true. But don't worry if that doesn't make sense. That's going to be for a later lesson. I just wanted to tease your brain so that you're still interested, inshallah. Okay, so now we've been studying an argument. And we've seen there are some interesting arguments, there are some trivial arguments, there are some weird arguments. So now it's time to decide what is a good argument. What are we aiming for? What is the criteria that we need so that we can go and try to apply that to Islam and try to bring our conclusions out. And there's two main ones: validity and soundness. Soundness we can only have if we have validity. We can only have soundness if we have validity. You can only be the age of 20 if you've passed the age of 15. One requires the other. So we need to discuss the first one first, which is validity, because we're not going to get to soundness until we have validity. There is a very strong mathematical definition of validity that was given by some big professors, including Volker Halbach from the University of Oxford, and it's a tremendous definition. But it's such a strange definition that it took me a good 2 days to understand it after the professor mentioned it one time. So I'm not going to use that one. I'm going to use this other one my first professor taught me, Graham Stevens, in 2017, because the definition does the job, and it's a brilliant definition, and he was such a good teacher, mashallah. So here's what the definition is. An argument is valid if and only if. When I say if and only if, I mean there is no other way it can be valid. This is the only way we can achieve this characteristic, this virtue of being valid. It is only valid if and only if the truth of the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So that means once you have the premises, you must have the conclusion. You must be able to derive the conclusion. You cannot go anywhere. You have to go. You must be able to go from the premises to the conclusion. So what does that mean? That means if however many premises we have, whether it's premise 1 and premise 2 and premise 3 and premise 4 and all the way to premise 100, we get, if all of those premises are correct, the conclusion is correct, then the argument is valid. If premise 1 is correct and the conclusion must be correct because premise 1 is correct, then we have a valid argument. So however many premises we have, whether it's 1, 2, 3 or 1,000 or 10,000, if they are all true, theoretically speaking, we don't have to be able to tell whether they're true or not. We don't have to verify them scientifically, no. We just have to entertain if they're true, hypothetically speaking, possibly. Then is the conclusion definitely true because the premises are true? So we can state any, and we'll get to the example inshallah. So the first example we gave is actually, also the second example is a good example. Example 2 is a valid argument. Let's go, what is example 2? It's over here. Socrates is a human. Premise 1. Premise 2, all humans are truculent. Again, we don't have to know whether premise 2 is true or not. We just have to hypothesize, just assume that it's true. Whatever this property is, we're just going to assume humans are this thing, truculent. So when we get the conclusion Socrates is truculent, the conclusion has to follow from the premises. You cannot say premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true and then go on to say the conclusion is false. Or maybe the conclusion is false or maybe it's true. No. The conclusion without a shadow of a doubt, with 100% yaqeen, with certainty, is true if premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true in this example. This is very important, brothers, and we'll flesh that out.
What does this word truculent mean?
Very good question. In fact, now's the right time to explain it. Truculent means easily angered. Someone gets into fights very quickly. They're easily angered. Now let me ask you a question. Do you actually think all humans are truculent? Every single human? Of course not. We all know, many of the uncles, Maulana Salim, inshallah, hopefully myself, we're not truculent people. We don't get into arguments easily. We don't start fights with people easily. It would take quite a lot to make us angry, inshallah. So, are all humans truculent? Really? In reality? Does anyone believe everyone's truculent? No.
Some degree of, everybody would have some degree of.
True, some degree. But that's not what we're expressing. We're expressing every single human without an exception. That means we're including prophets now, alayhimus salam. We're making this claim is that they're all easily angered. Does anyone have the audacity to say that can be true? No. If we said maybe some humans are truculent, yes, that's true. We all know some humans who get easily angered.
And maybe if you, in your experience, could be majority, that's
yes. Yeah.
So one exception is enough. If you have one person who is not like that,
yes.
that argument is wrong. This premise is wrong. Absolutely.
Yes.
In this example, it's not a valid argument.
Definitely not. It's not true.
Yes.
True argument, it's valid argument.
Yes.
That's the point.
We're going to get to that in a minute, inshallah. So the point is, we know the argument is bogus, we know it doesn't work, we know the conclusion might be false. But that's not the point. The point is, if premise 1 was true and premise 2 was true, we were entertaining it hypothetically, then the conclusion has to be true. So the best way to think about this, dear uncles and brothers, is I think it was one of the philosophers, he said, think about an alternative world where things are different. Let's say we don't exist on Earth. Let's call this Earth 1. Let's think about Earth 5. Maybe there's another Earth called Earth 5. And humans are very different on Earth 5. Maybe it's another solar system. Maybe they're all truculent. That's where we assume that premise 1 and premise 2 is true. In philosophy and in logic in particular, we have to be able to use our imagination to just entertain the premises being true. So as long as there is a possibility, if you don't know the term truculent, it's very easy to imagine, because you don't really have to imagine anything. But this is the point. So, okay, what are we trying to get from this? What we're trying to say really is, this is the property of validity. This is a valid argument, but it's still not good enough. Why? Because you can get dodgy conclusions and you can make dodgy arguments even if it's valid. So we need something more than validity. We now need the gold standard. And the gold standard is a sound argument. Not just valid, but sound. But it's very important to understand that soundness comes after validity. So we need at least this much to get to soundness, inshallah. Khair. So here's another example, because we've been using some other points. Another valid argument. If let's use me in particular, Sami. If I think, then I exist. I think, therefore I exist. This is actually Descartes' famous argument, simplified. It might seem very simple, but there's a reason he said all of this. But we can all agree this works. Because if something thinks, it must exist. You can't have something non-existence thinking. You can't have empty space or something dead or something that doesn't exist thinking. No. In order to think, you have to exist beforehand. Even then, it's not enough sometimes. A rock can't think even though it exists. Premise 2 is I think, therefore we conclude I exist. Okay, let's look at some invalid examples. And example 4 is very important. So let's skip to that, because example 3 we've already covered. Premise 1, all females are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a human. Conclusion, Socrates is a mortal. Now you might think, why is this argument invalid? Is premise 1 true? Does everybody agree all females are mortal? Everyone agree? Someone shook their heads. Does anyone want to, if you disagree, mention your reason, inshallah. By mortal, let me make it very specific, because we're Muslims at the end of the day, so we believe obviously in resurrection. By mortal I mean that it's possible at some point in their life they die, that they perish from the face of this earth and they go into the grave. So does anybody disagree and say there is at least one female who will never die and who will just go to the day of resurrection without dying beforehand? No, and this would be a contradiction of Aqeedah. So no one would believe this, and no non-Muslim would believe this either. It's very hard to convince a non-Muslim females are immortal. There is at least one. No, they'd be like, you're crazy, you're not listening to science. So everybody agrees. Every single woman, every single female, in other words, is mortal. She will die at some point. Whether it be, your wife, your daughter, your sister, your cousin, your teacher, your stada, etc.
Sorry, but you're assuming females are humans. Females can be anything else as well. Is Jahannam a female?
Good question. So we're going to make certain assumptions.
Based on an assumption, a premise before, all females are humans.
That's true. That's technically very true. So Uncle's brought a very good point in, but that goes a bit deep, so I'm going to leave that for now. So we do make certain assumptions when we give these examples, but it's not far-fetched, because it's not far-fetched to think every female is a... You know what, to make this example better, I should have written all female humans are mortal. That way there's no ambiguity. Premise 2, Socrates is a human. Does anybody disagree and think the philosopher Socrates is an alien or something else? Or a rhino or not a human? No. Everybody agrees premise 2 is true. So we all know for a fact, we're not hypothesizing anymore. We're talking reality. We're talking here, Earth 1. All females are mortal. Very not controversial, fine, true. Premise 2, Socrates is a human. Again, we're all agreed, completely fine. Conclusion, Socrates is a mortal. Does everybody believe Socrates is mortal? I definitely believe he's mortal. I think everybody believes he's mortal. But there's still an issue with the argument. What's the issue?
The premise doesn't mention that Socrates is female.
That's perfectly, Jazakallah khair, Dr. Mudassib. That's exactly the reasoning. These premises don't lead to this conclusion. It's like a path. You're walking down this path, and you know that Masjid al-Falah is on this road, Kensington Gardens. Now you believe Kensington Gardens exists, but you've walked down another path and you've ended up at another masjid. Another masjid, for example. That doesn't mean you don't believe the conclusion is true, but you know that path no longer leads to the conclusion to Masjid al-Falah. Similarly, these premises do not lead to this conclusion. Everything is true. Premise 1 is true. Premise 2 is true. The conclusion is true. It's not hard to convince you guys about these things. We all believe it. And it's easy to believe. It's just simple facts. Simple reality. But the problem is for the philosopher and the mathematician and the logician that the premises do not lead to the conclusion. Now, why is this so important? Because every single one of us has a good reason to believe in the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the complete and utter truthfulness of every statement that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam made, in every article of the fundamental aqeedah of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. But when we try to convince non-Muslims, we have to take them on a journey from premises to conclusion. And even though, without a shadow of a doubt, in our minds, in the mind of Isaac Newton, in the mind of Gottfried Leibniz, in the mind of St. Thomas Aquinas, in Fakhruddin al-Razi, in Imam al-Ghazali, in Imam al-Sunusi, in Imam al-Nasafi, every single one of them believed without doubt God exists. They wrote theses on it. And yet, they still have a duty, which is to show the non-Muslim, or to show somebody, why? Why did we come to this belief, to this conclusion that God exists? And this is the point of the argument. We have to build and incorporate the correct premises to get to this conclusion. That's so important. So I'm coming towards the end now. I will just...
Sorry, one.
Yes.
So, actually, the premises are also conclusions of other premises.
Exactly, yes. So one very important question this raises, and someone mentioned this as well before to me a few months ago. How do we come to the premises? Why do we believe the premises? Now this is a question that's a bit deeper, but it's actually also simpler. If you have the right reasons to believe the premises, that's fine. That's all you need. Now what are the right reasons? That's the topic of epistemology and philosophy. But most of you will know already. The human brain and the human mind and the human themselves are quite good at figuring out the truth from falsehood. Now, why do you believe, for example, all females are mortal? There's many reasons. Science suggests to us that all humans, eventually their body will die and decompose, etc. Our shared experience, every person we've met who's reached a certain age, especially if they've gone over the age of 100, before the age of 110 has died. So every human we know, none of them have lived beyond 150 for sure, as far as I'm aware, according to historical evidence. So we have all different reasons to believe certain premises. Now, what are good reasons and what are bad reasons? That's for a future day. Some premises you derive from other arguments. So you bring in another argument. But all of these premises are quite simple. Everyone would believe them anyway, so there's no need to try to prove them. They're all pretty straightforward. Coming towards the end, inshallah. One thing is very important as well. So now we know what we're trying to do. We're trying to make a valid and a sound argument. We have to be very specific with our words. Words really matter. Because when you have certain assumptions or you use certain words that don't make it clear, then people won't follow your premises to your conclusion. A very good example, this one's, you'll like this one as an image. If I say all of Brother Ahmed's hamsters are sat on a bank, premise 1. Premise 2, Ahmed is sat with his hamsters. Okay, so what are we saying? We're saying theorize. Think about this hypothetical scenario. There's a brother called Ahmed. Whose name is Ahmed here? Jazakallah khaira. Uncle Ahmed. Who's Uncle Ahmed, inshallah? Let's say, hypothetically, Uncle, do you have any hamsters? Okay, we're going to hypothesize. Now, Uncle Ahmed in the future, he owns some hamsters. Now, his hamsters are sat on a bank. But again, the problem is bank is not specified. There's some ambiguity, and I'm going to show you the problem with this. So we agree. We're hypothesizing premise 1 is true. Premise 2, Ahmed is sat with his hamsters. Uncle Ahmed is sat with his pets on top of this bank. What is our conclusion? Ahmed is sat on top of a financial institution. So this is the picture we painted in our head. A couple of hamsters sat on a bank. Imagine that's a real bank, for example. Now, what was the problem there? The problem is the word bank is ambiguous. Do we mean a bank as a financial institution, or do we mean a river bank? Like this. This is probably much more likely. They're sat on a river bank. You might think this is very trivial, but every single day of our lives, we communicate with people, and because we use a few words or we use a few terminologies which they don't understand, they might come to the wrong conclusion, such as Ahmed is sat on top of a financial institution. So being precise with our words is very, very, very important. And again, we'll give Islamic examples later on in the future. So I don't want to take too much time, but the last thing I would say is, we've covered ambiguity and validity. Is soundness, just the one last thing. So the gold standard that I was talking about before. An argument is sound if and only if, the only way, is that the truth of the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So again, if the premises are true, if hypothetically the conclusion is also true. But then there's one more addition, and the premises are actually, in fact, in reality true. So now we're no longer hypothetical. We're saying, it's not just that the premises are true, so the conclusion must be true. Now the premises are actually true, so the conclusion has to be true in reality. And a very famous example of an argument that is sound is René Descartes' argument. If something thinks, it must exist. Everybody would agree with this. Because in order to think, which usually requires a brain or something, it means that the brain and the person exists in reality. So, if the second premise is, I think, me, Sami, or Uncle Ahmed thinks, then the conclusion is they must exist. And we will continue to go over these concepts next session, and we'll use some Islamic examples. But it's very important, because once we get these concepts, then we know why something like the Kalam cosmological argument is actually sound, and is definitely true. And one more thing, every scientific theory can also be put into this framework according to the deontological nomological model, the DN model. And that's very important, because that's how you actually know some scientific arguments are false, because some of their premises are wrong, meaning we can't ever reach the conclusion. But that will be for a future session, inshallah. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.
Any questions? Any questions? आसान है कुछ चीज़ों को तो क्वांटम फिजिक्स में जिस तरह से टाइम एंड स्पेस को जिस तरह क्वांटम फिजिक्स ने डिस्क्राइब किया has been described by Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari himself in his books, and that is amazing to look at and feel like wow, कैसे अल्लाह ने लोगों को इंस्पायर किया तक़वा के साथ आखिरत की फिक्र के साथ दीन की फिक्र के साथ अल्लाह रास्ते पे उसने इसके लिए बहुत कंट्रीब्यूशन इमाम गज़ाली बहुत कुछ किया। अपने रुश्क को तो ये लोग हीरो बने, ये अलग बात है कि अपने रुश्क को उस मानव मुसलमान मानते हैं। सवाल नहीं है मुसलमान मानते हैं, लेकिन ये कहते हैं कि वो अपना मानते हैं, क्योंकि हमारे आइडियाज़ हैं। लेकिन गैर मुसलमान फिर रोकते आगे अभी चला जारी रहेगी उसके सवाल थोड़े से क्विज़ के साथ पहले यानी कुछ आपसे पहले पूछ लूँगा कि आपने पढ़ा तो समझ में आया कि सोच के आई इस रिकॉर्डिंग को दोबारा सुन लीजिए, कुछ गूगल कर लीजिए, आइडिया लीजिए, थोड़ा सा दो हाउ थोड़ा सा कूदेंगे तो हल्का हल्का समझ में आ जाएगा। आने से पहले 10-15 मिनट लगा थोड़ा सा लगा बस समझ में आ, ठीक है। वैल्यू है इसकी समझ में आ रही कि न भी आया समझ में थोड़े अरसे के बाद आने लगेगा। जब ये बात समझ में आने लगेगी ना तो फिर आप जब किसी से बात करेंगे गैर मुस्लिम से या अपने बच्चों से किसी से भी आप बिल्कुल सेफ ग्राउंड है। आपके ईमान का मुझे प्रॉब्लम हो गया अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह आपका ईमान लगी मैंने इसीलिए मोबाइल में चल पड़े बस इंशाअल्लाह ताला। So we end the day. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك ونشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. Gently, bagair making any noise. बाहर जाए, ऐसा